Ready, Kafka? Hello, and welcome back to J Hutch Talks Too Much. It's been a while since the last time we spoke. I think my last podcast episode was 3 years ago. So it's been a long time since we have last seen each other. Thanks very much for your patience. I got busy with my other work that I do, busier than I thought I was going to be. And then I ended up getting COVID in the last couple of weeks. So that also threw off my plans for doing more of these episodes. So it ended up being a longer break than I was certainly anticipating. I'm excited to be doing this again, and I'm happy to have you back as viewers. Once again, just right off the bat, if you like the conversation tonight, please feel free to like the video. And if you haven't subscribed yet to J Hutch Talks Too Much, if you're not entirely sure what it is that we do here at J Hutch Talks Too Much, sometimes I do these individual videos like the one that I'm doing tonight. Sometimes I have guests on, talk about literature, talk about movies, talk about politics, and usually focus on one particular thing in a show. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much. One of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of months is I've been focusing in on one particular author, and the author that I chose to focus in on for now is Franz Kafka. And I'm sure I have, I think, this video and one more after this, and then I'll probably choose another author to focus on. So if anybody has any recommendations as to maybe who I could do next, please let me know. We started off with a video of two of his works, The Judgment and Metamorphosis. Then I had Ryan Cook on about a month ago or maybe 6 weeks ago to talk about The Trial. And tonight we are doing In the Penal Colony. And I, right off the bat, do want to say that whenever I think about this story, In the Penal Colony, it reminds me of the first time that I read it. And actually, when I read it again for this podcast, it's the first time that I had read it, at least in full, since I was in my last year of high school when we were reading it in class. And I have this memory every time I think of the story of being in another class. And I was talking to this girl that I had a crush on at the time. And she said, "Oh, what are you reading?" And I said, "In the Penal Colony." And she laughed hysterically. And I said, "Penal colonies are no laughing matters." And she never spoke to me again after that. But that's in my memory of In the Penal Colony. I do have to, of course, acknowledge that of all the stories that I've done so far, it is the funniest title that we have looked at. But the material itself is not all that amusing, I will say. But of the Kafka works that we have looked at so far, Judgment, Metamorphosis, The Trial, and now In the Penal Colony, I think this one might be my favorite of all of them. And maybe it's because it's the one that I have, it had been the longest since I had read it. So maybe that's why I'm thinking that. But I do think it's a really phenomenal story all the way through. it's a shorter work. It's not a novel. It's about a 30-page story, and I do think, as much as I love the trial and as much as I enjoy the castle, which I'll talk about in my final Kafka video, I think that when I think of Kafka's best work, I think that he may work at his best on a smaller scale, despite the fact that I think he can write great novels. Although, as we've talked about in previous videos, he never finished a single novel. And obviously, that had to do with all sorts of other issues with Kafka, his kind of anxieties, his self-doubt. So he would probably lose in personal enthusiasm for his novels as he was writing them, or lose confidence in them. That's probably the real reason, I would imagine, why he never finished them, rather than them being weaker works than his shorter works. But I do think that the smaller Kafka texts seem to impact me even more than the longer text, and that's not to diminish the kind of effect that the trial and the castle, and I haven't read the other one, America, but the trial or the castle is still, I think, are still great works. But I do really love shorter works, and I especially love In the Penal Colony. So give you a little bit of information about In the Penal Colony, and then I'm going to try and say, well, I can't avoid saying Penal Colony repeatedly. So, have a drink every time that I say it, and refrain from lifting any heavy machinery after the podcast is over. So he writes this story in 1914, and he revises it in 1918, and it's published in 1919. A lot of Kafka's works are unpublished during his lifetime, specifically the unfinished works, but quite a few of his finished short stories are published, and In the Penal Colony was one of the ones that was published. So published in 1919. It's similar to the stories that we have looked at so far, in that it's written as the tone of it, or the style of it, is slightly dreamlike, veering towards a nightmare. So you might recall that when I was talking to Ryan about the trial, I said that the trial in many ways feels like a lot of my nightmares do, in that they're not just, horrifying moments just over and over repeatedly, but they are generally just odd and bizarre moments that kind of culminate in a kind of terrible thing that ends up waking me up. But it's not that that there's terrible things going on constantly in my nightmares. They're just odd situations. But even just dreams at the best of times are kind of odd situations. And I will say, I said it before in those other videos, and I'll say it again, that I do think that Kafka is really sort of tapping in to that kind of dreamlike world, which I think is partly what makes him such an effective writer, because, he's so often speaking to an element of ourselves that we're not even necessarily aware in our waking life is there, until we read his book. And then there's something that seems oddly familiar about the world that he's creating. And I would say that that's true of In the Penal Colony as well, although this one is probably a bit more gruesome than the ones that we have looked at so far. And also similar to the other texts that we have looked at, Kafka is withholding certain information from us. So, if we go back, Metamorphosis, we never find out why the main character, Gregor Samsa, in that book turns into a cockroach. That's just left unexplained totally. In the trial, the most significant aspect of that book is the fact that Joseph K., the main character, has been charged with a crime, and he doesn't know what it is, and we don't know what it is, and we never find out what it is. Now, there's certain things that are being withheld in this story too. For one, there's no no characters in the story are given names, right? There's four characters. There is the traveler, who's kind of the focal point of the story. We kind of, in some ways, he's not the one that's telling the story, but we very much see the world through his eyes. There's the officer, there's the condemned man, and then there's the soldier. And I'll talk more about those characters the more that we go on, but we're never given any names for them. That's not totally out of left field for Kafka. In the trial, the main character is Joseph K, but he's mostly referred to as K throughout, but we never find out Joseph K's last name. I don't think we're meant to assume that his last name is actually just an initial. And then the character, again, in the castle is also named K. So he does that frequently, writing characters without giving their full name. But also, the story that we're looking at today is obviously taking place on a penal colony. Time for a drink. Just 1 second. But we don't know where the penal colony is. It's certainly, we could say it's reminiscent of Devil's Island. Devil's Island was a French penal colony. It was just off the coast of South America, close to Brazil. It was open for just over 100 years, from 1852 to 1953. And Devil's Island was this notoriously brutal place. And at its worst, I think 75% of the prisoners there died. Their death rate was 75% at Devil's Island at its worst. Now, I don't want to say that the penal colony in this particular story is Devil's Island. I think what's important is that Kafka leaves that out quite purposefully. And we're not meant to, I don't think, we're not meant to really take guesses as to where this actually is. Just like in the trial, we're not meant to spend our time trying to figure out or guess what it is that Kay did. That's not the point. The point is that we just don't know what it is that we did. And in many ways, it's the same thing here with the penal colony. It doesn't really matter that we don't know where it is. In fact, it's this kind of in this sort of this no place, and again, we can say in some ways that the place of our dreams, but it is French. We learn that both the traveler and the officer in the story, they speak French. So I think that we're sort of meant to look at this as being a French colony that Kafka is describing. And therefore, I think we could say that he is probably influenced by the sort of horrifying brutality that occurred in real life in Devil's Island. And we can also gather, of course, that the traveler is traveling from the homeland of France to this penal colony, wherever it might be. It is in a place that we learn is tropical. But he's traveling from France to this penal colony. And the story begins, and I'll kind of just explain the story for a little bit and interject a little bit of information, and then explain sort of at the end what I think that the story is doing, what I think makes it an interesting one. It begins with the officer who is showing off this device to the traveler, kind of explaining it in some detail. And the device turns out to be this execution device that they use at the penal colony on people who have been charged with a crime. And there's a condemned man in the scene who is about to receive the death penalty via this execution device. And the traveler at first is kind of disinterested when it comes to this machine. And he's obviously not, particularly, enamored with it. But the officer, on the other hand, he's very clearly, talks about it as if he's very proud of this machine. And he wants to tell the traveler all about it. Meanwhile, neither the condemned man nor the soldier that's also in the room can understand what the officer is saying because they don't speak French, which I think is important, and we'll come back to that aspect in a few minutes. And the officer then explains what's going to happen to the condemned person, what happens to people who have been charged with the death penalty. And what happens is they lie down on this bed, which is part of the machine. They lie face down at first, and this instrument that's called the harrow engraves the sentence into his skin. And it's this 12-hour process. And the officer explains, like, at first they're partway through, like a couple hours in, they're offered some food, they're offered rice, and usually at that point in time they take it. Uh, Later on in this 12-hour process, they don't want to eat anymore, but at first they do. But it's usually around the halfway point, at the 6th hour mark, that the condemned person begins to understand what it is they've been charged with. Because until that moment, the condemned does not know what they have been charged with. And they are able to figure it out because they could decipher the script that is being written into them, because it's not only this kind of needle that is inscribing things into their skin, but there's also one that squirts out water to clean the blood away. But at that point, so that's 6 hours in. And then the rest of the process takes about another 6 hours, at which point, and here I'm quoting, the harrow pierces him through, tosses him into the pit where the body smacks down on the bloody water and cotton wool. That concludes the judgment. And we, the soldier and myself, shovel some earth over him. So of course it's a death sentence, and again the condemned man doesn't know his sentence before his punishment. As the officer says, it would be useless to tell him. It will be put to him physically, right? Why should we tell him? He's going to find out when he looks at it on his skin. And of course, not knowing the nature of his sentence, he also, importantly, has no opportunity to defend himself. Obviously, before he receives the death penalty. And that is actually quite similar to the trial, right? So in that novel, Kay likewise doesn't know why he's being charged with a crime, and consequently, he doesn't have any adequate means with which to defend himself. And he certainly tries throughout the book, but he, of course, really can't in any significant way because he just doesn't know what he's even been charged with. And in the Penal Colony was actually written right around the same time as he was writing the trial. So clearly, this extrajudicial aspect of the legal system, a system where the power system is set up basically to declare anyone it wants to guilty. This was something that Kafka was clearly very concerned with at the time. Now, there are differences, very crucial differences between In the Penal Colony and the trial, because unlike the trial, the reader gets actually insight into why the condemned is being charged before the condemned does. Now, in fact, there's another difference on top of that. Kay in the trial never finds out what he was being condemned for. In the Penal Colony, the condemned man does find out several hours before they die. But we also, as the reader, unlike in the trial, are given insight as to what this person has been charged with. So in this particular case, with this condemned man in the Penal Colony, the one that's the focus of our attention, so the condemned man was a guard for a captain. And as part of a guard's duty, when the captain is asleep, the guard is outside of his door. And every hour, the guard is required to get up and salute outside of the captain's door, right? Just salute the door once an hour. Now, in this particular case, the captain caught this man not doing that, caught him sleeping outside the door and not getting up and saluting it. And so then the captain goes and gets a riding crop and strikes him across the face. Now, the condemned man, who is the guard, responds to this by grabbing the captain's leg and saying, "Drop that whip or I'll gobble you up." And for that, he's being condemned to death. And what is being inscribed on him is the phrase, "Respect your commanding officer." That's what's being engraved into him. So I think we could probably say that this is somewhat of an overreaction. But that is one significant difference between the trial and In the Penal Colony, is that we learn what it is that he is being charged with. Let me just take another drink here. But also in the penal colony, there are actually many reasons for why it's difficult to know what you are being sentenced for. Not only do they withhold this information from the condemned man right until the last minute, but also the condemned man doesn't speak the same language as the people who are charging him with a crime. And moreover, even the traveler who does happen to speak the same language, speaks French, when he's shown the inscription, like, here's what we're going to engrave into this person's skin, he can't read it because of the way that it's written. So there's this constant idea that no matter what, you just don't have access to the information that the powerful people have who are working to pass judgment on you and condemn you. You just never know exactly why it is that they're doing this. Um, Now, another major part of the story is the fact that the officer keeps talking about this old commandant. And the old commandant, excuse me, the old commandant was the person who created this execution device. Now, the old commandant is dead, and his replacement, the new commandant, he's clearly not a fan of this device. And what we find out as the story progresses, is that the officer uh, is trying to convince the traveler on this device and how great it is and what a wonderful system it is that we have here. And look how fantastic this is, and look how it works. What a marvel it is. He's trying to convince the traveler of all of this so that the traveler will go and speak to the new commandant and put in a good word for this device, say how much he likes it. And if he does that, the officer says, then maybe we can save this type of execution. We can keep on doing this. But the traveler wants no part of this. He's horrified by the device, and he refuses to go to the new commandant and talk about how great it is. And this at this point, this seems to signify the end of the road, right? The officer, realizing that he's not been able to convince the traveler to go and talk to the new commandant about how great this execution device is, he then decides, okay, rather than the condemned person getting on it, I'm going to get on it. That's what the officer says. I'm going to get on the bed myself, and I'm going to have the device inscribe the words "be just" into his body, which he then starts to do. But the device then badly breaks down in the middle of that process and just outright mutilates him in quick fashion. Doesn't imprint anything into him. It just kills him quite quickly. So at that point, the soldier and the condemned man, who has now been saved, take the traveler. They get him out of there. They take the traveler to the grave of the old commandant, which is basically hidden away. It's like behind this table and chairs. And he gets there, pushes aside the chairs, I think, and the table where people were sitting, and he looks at the grave of the old commandant, and it has an inscription on it. It's interesting because inscriptions and engravings are a big part of this story, right? Things that are written onto something. But there is this moment where he's looking at this gravestone, and what the gravestone says, and this is just in like the last page of the story, says, "Here rests the old commandant. His supporters, who now have no name, dug him this grave and set this stone for him. It is prophesied that after a certain number of years, the commandant will rise again, and from the premises here, lead his followers on to the reconquest of the colony. Believe and be patient." So the traveler reads this, and at this point, he decides, I'm getting out of here. And he decides he's going to catch the steamship back home. And he starts to get on the steamship, but the soldier and the condemned man have started to now chase after him, as the text says, probably because they wanted to make the traveler take them with him. But he makes sure that they don't get on the boat. When they start to get on, he like brushes them away to make sure. And we end with him sort of traveling off and them not getting on the boat. And that's the story in the penal colony. So what's interesting about this story I mean, I just think this is such a well-written and incredibly fascinating story. I mean, first of all, it's reviewing a lot of the things that we've already talked about in the previous Kafka videos. So obviously, power relations is a crucial element in so much of Kafka's writing, whether it's the father in the judgment who is condemning his own son to death by drowning, or whether it's Joseph K. in the trial being charged and eventually executed by a legal system, despite the fact that he never knows why that this is happening. And we talk about how I've talked about in previous videos, or me and Ryan in the trial video talked about how Kafka is often showing us that this power dynamic frequently functions the way it does, is able to be successful because people have this tendency of going along with it. Jorg Bendeman, the son in the judgment, just listens to his father, who condemns him to death by drowning. He immediately leaves the house, goes to the bridge, and jumps off of it, throws himself off of it into the water. And in the penal colony, we're seeing something similar. We have this officer who is enamored with the dead old commandant, who has been treated like, as we can see in that message on the gravestone, has been treated like this supernatural, godlike figure, this man who they expect will one day be resurrected and come back to rule over the island. That's what his followers believe. Of course, this brings to mind the beliefs that underpin certain religions, and there have certainly been many people who have read In the Penal Colony as a commentary on religion, just as they see that at work in a lot of Kafka's stories, partly because of the influence of Kafka's friend Max Brod, who was the man responsible for getting a lot of Kafka's unpublished works published after Kafka died. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the castle. And sometimes I can see it and sometimes I can't. And I can certainly, given that quote on the gravestone, I could certainly see it in this case. But ultimately, I do think that one of the reasons why this execution device has been used as often as it had been used is because people just sort of went along with it. They accepted the word of this old commandant, who was just kind of like this cult figure, right? And you can kind of see that in terms of, you can sort of see that in the way a lot of cults work, this leader who's saying these unbelievably bizarre things that don't make any reasonable, rational sense. And they end up being successful because people are, going along with it. And along those lines, then, I think it's interesting that this island should, at least in some ways, resemble Devil's Island, because it brings to my mind one of the most notorious cases that is in some ways related to Devil's Island, and that's the Dreyfus Affair. Now, some of you who are watching this video might be aware of the Dreyfus Affair, but for those of you who aren't, I'll talk just a little bit about it for a few minutes. The Dreyfus Affair begins in 1894 in France. And it begins because this evidence emerges that there is a traitor in the French army who is passing information to Germany. Now, there's no evidence about who the traitor was, but there is a culprit that is pointed out and is charged, and that's a Jewish military officer named Alfred Dreyfus. And he ends up being found guilty in a secret military trial and sent to, of course, Devil's Island, despite the fact that he denied guilt and the fact that there was no evidence to support a guilty verdict. And in fact, in the ensuing years, in the years that followed the guilty verdict, evidence ends up coming to light which implicated the real traitor, who was not Alfred Dreyfus. It was Major Ferdinand, forgive me if I'm getting the wording of this wrong, but Major Ferdinand Walson Esterhazy. And when that evidence it comes up, when people are made aware of it, it's covered up. And Dreyfus continues to stay in Devil's Island. Now, here's a case then where Dreyfus remained a known, innocent, but imprisoned man because everyone just went along with it. I mean, not everybody, because not everybody knew the truth of what was happening, but a lot of people in the military did know the truth. And he was just kept there as a guilty man because, it was just, well, what's the point? What's the point of, making waves about all this? And there could have been many people who stood up and said, no, he's an innocent man. Let's let him out. But they didn't, they just went along with it. And I will say, I'm not to say that it's a good thing, but I can understand why people didn't stand up and say something, because when you have a system that is set up which holds secret trials in order to render somebody guilty without evidence and then continues to keep him imprisoned even when evidence of his innocence is brought forward. I mean, if that's the system that you're up against, there's no telling what they're going to do to you if you try to point out what they have been doing. And so I think people were probably understandably frightened about speaking out. And the way that the system operates, then, the very way that the system functions, ends up making it hard to speak out against it. And this is in many ways how Kafka writes about the execution device in the story. Its very existence was meant to force people to accept it. The officer at one point tells the traveler that there was a time in the past, back when these types of executions that he's talking about were popular. There was a time when there was a huge audience that would come to watch them. And so you can sort of see that this functions the same way as like public hangings used to do in real life. I mean, that was the whole point of hanging people in public as a deterrent, so people would go and watch these things and be so horrified by them to say, well, I never want to be in that position. I don't want to be that hanging person up there. So I'm never going to do the things that they have been accused of doing. The whole point of them then is just to strike fear into people that this is what happens if you don't follow the rules. And remember, too, in this story, what this man is being condemned to death for not saluting a door every hour, for not being subservient to even the most absurd requests by the powerful. So if you can be condemned to death in the most brutal way, then why would you ever want to speak out against this horrible system? I don't think we're meant to believe that the condemned man in this story, that this is some kind of unusual sentencing. I'm guessing that this has been the kind of a thing that people have been condemned to death for years in this penal colony. So if people go and they sit in the audience and watch this and find these kind of really absurd, you haven't been subservient enough to power and therefore you're being condemned to death, then, obviously, if you speak out against this system, probably you're going to end up being killed by this execution device as well. So, and again, what Kafka does in the story that makes it different from the trial and the judgment, though, which is interesting, is that it shows you what can potentially happen if you resist power, if you don't go along. Now, in some sense, he did this in the Metamorphosis. I talked a little bit about that because one of the things I think is going on in the Metamorphosis is that, Gregor Samsa, the main character of that story, he's somebody who doesn't really go along with things, or at the very least gets to a point where he no longer wants to go along with just the general way of things, right? The general sort of social norms, the status quo. He just doesn't want to go along with it anymore. And Kafka shows, him turning into this cockroach or this vermin, because I think on some level, Kafka is saying that's how you are perceived if you are a person that doesn't go along with things, who doesn't just accept things the way that they are. But I think here in the penal colony, it's somewhat different. So to go back to the Dreyfus Affair for a second, eventually information does start to filter out about Dreyfus's innocence. Various people like Emile Zola, who maybe some of you have read. Zola, uh, quite a famous French novelist from the late 19th century. He also wrote essays in favor of Dreyfus. And eventually, Dreyfus was brought back to France to be retried. And guess what happened? He was found guilty again. And at that point, it just became clear that this was an example of anti-Semitism in France at the time, that Dreyfus was just an easy fall guy because there were so many anti-Semitic views at work in France that he would be an easy target to say, this is the person, this is the guilty person, let's send them away. So it became sort of just an obvious example of anti-Semitism at the time. And this was a major story. And I think that Kafka, as a Jewish German-speaking Czech, around 15 years after these incidents took place, I think on some level he would have been attuned to this story. But eventually the public outcry in France just became too much, and the French president was largely pressured into giving Dreyfus a pardon, which he was. So in this case, the public resists. They challenge those in power, despite the many obstacles in doing so. And eventually, despite all the efforts to ensure that he doesn't, eventually Dreyfus does go free. Now, there's other elements at work in the Dreyfus Affair as well. Like, for instance, I mentioned Emile Zola, who was one of the few people. He wasn't the only person, I should say, but he was one of few people who were calling out the French military for their actions. And as a result, Zola himself was subsequently brought to trial on charges of criminal libel, and he was convicted, and he was eventually forced to flee the country. And I think he eventually did return, but that's, again, another price to pay for being the person calling out the crimes or the wrongdoings of those in power. Once again, the system is set up to try to make sure that everybody goes along with it. So again, nevertheless, despite that, the story of the Dreyfus Affair does demonstrate that resistance can work. Despite all the obstacles, despite the fact that Dreyfus was found guilty a second time, even when the information was at that point public knowledge, despite the fact that the people who brought that knowledge to the public were also charged as criminals, Dreyfus does eventually go free. So resistance, there's still a lot of issues at work, but the resistance does in many ways work in that case. Now, look what's happening in Kafka's story in the penal colony. At this point, when the story is actually taking place, the mood of the colony has changed. The people have obviously made it clear that they don't like this form of punishment. The resistance to those in power, in fact, is the emerging resistance against those in power is demonstrated very early on in the text when we find out why the condemned man has been condemned. He's not just condemned for disobeying orders, which is one thing that would demonstrate the fact that, people are becoming less subservient. But even when he's caught and the guy comes out with a riding crop, he doesn't suddenly snap into line. He grabs the captain by the ankles and says, "Drop that whip or I'll gobble you up." He does not act as if he's intimidated by this person at all. And again, that's a significant kind of form of resistance. There seems to be dissension that is happening on the island, that is at the very least emerging on this island. And important in all of this, too, is this idea of the language barrier, right? The condemned man, I think Kafka withholds so much information, which I really like the fact that he does that. I also like authors who reveal a lot, but I like also when authors kind of withhold a lot of significant information, because it allows us as readers to do a lot of work to kind of come to our own conclusions about what's going on in the story. But I do think that the condemned man appears to be indigenous to this tropical penal colony. And, I think it's important to not forget the fact that penal colonies were frequently European attempts to colonize certain regions of the world. So, France, for example, had tried to colonize Guyana since the 1760s. That's the region where Devil's Island ends up being. They had been trying to colonize the region since the 1760s, and they hadn't been successful at all in doing so. So around 100 years later, their new course of action is to turn the region into a penal colony as a form of colonization. So you could say that Kafka's story in the penal colony is a potential commentary on colonialism. Again, the power dynamic in the story is set up so that it is the French-speaking colonizer, as represented by the officer, who has the knowledge and the power, which is the knowledge which is withheld from the oppressed and the colonized. And this allows him to oppress the colonized. And it's through this execution device that the officer, the colonizer, is going to violently bring the colonized to some sort of enlightened awareness, some sort of enlightened knowledge about themselves, right? It's by reading their own sentence that they come to some understanding about who they are and what they've done. And this is a very typical attitude of colonizers, right? The only way that they can justify colonizing this land that somebody else inhabits is by positioning their own values and beliefs as superior, as by even just assuming that their own values and beliefs are superior. And so then the mindset becomes, once we show this indigenous population our superior beliefs and values, they'll change their minds. And if they don't change their minds, then what they'll do is they'll probably just disappear, which is really just code for we'll kill them or we'll kick them off the land and deprive them of the resources that are crucial to their survival. That does tend to be sort of the mindset. And in their minds, it ends up being justified because, they have the superior values. And all of this is, again, significant, once again, when you consider that the condemned man is being condemned precisely because he isn't deferential enough to someone in power. He has not sufficiently accepted his superior as superior. He mocks him, and this is why he must die. But again, Kafka is showing us this world where people are starting to resist that. They're not being deferential to power, colonial power, or any power. When the traveler is taken to the grave of the old commandant and he reads that inscription once again says that the old commandant's supporters have no name. I mean, that really speaks to the fact that this was a system that is now reviled, right? Either nobody actually wants to be associated with this old commandant, or they're so publicly hated that they just won't even put their names on the gravestone. It's one of those two things is, I think, what we're sort of meant to assume. And when the grave inscription says that it is prophesied that the commandant will rise again, the text notes that it's the traveler who's reading it, but there's also sort of this group of people who he's kind of moved aside to look at the gravestone. And so now there's a group of people who are reading it together. And the traveler kind of looks behind him at these people after reading this section about the commandant will rise again, and notes that those people were smiling as if they had read the inscription at the same time and found it ridiculous. That's the words of the text. No one is taking the system seriously anymore, right? From the guy who says, drop that whip or I'll gobble you up, to the people who are reading this and smiling as if they find it ridiculous. They're all kind of refusing to accept it at this point. And again, it's working to sort of literally break down the system. The machine this execution device at the end of the story literally breaks down while killing what it seems to be its last supporter, right? This is the last person who is kind of working as a supporter of the system. He's the last one. And who I kind of almost sort of imagine as being a little bit like, Hitler in the bunker in the last days. I mean, this is written before that, but that's how it kind of comes across to me, right? Where Hitler ends up killing himself because, there's an awareness of it's over, and look at all the things I've done. Clearly, I'm not going to be judged well for these things. So it's over. So I'm going to be taking my own life. I mean, assuming this is what's going. It's hard to put myself in the mindset of Hitler, but I think that I'm imagining that that's probably what he was thinking at the time, and I'm imagining in many ways that this is what the officer is thinking as well. And again, this machine just breaks down, which is symbolic of the fact that this whole entire particular system that was at work for such a long time on this colony is breaking down as well. But this isn't the end of the story, because the end, like the last paragraph, really is, I think, just the best part of the story. There's a lot of great parts in the penal colony, but the end is when it really kind of solidifies as just a masterwork. Because again, the traveler is disgusted by this system, and when he's asked to put in a good word about it, he says that he won't do it, and in fact, he might even tell the new commandant that he doesn't like this device. But again, at the end, when he has the opportunity to allow the non-French officer and the condemned man on his boat when he's escaping, he outright prevents them from getting on. And I don't think that Kafka wants us to believe that things are going to be great on the penal colony now that this execution device is going on, even with the kind of growing dissent that's going on. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a penal colony, right? And penal colonies, like Devil's Island, which didn't include devices like these, as far as I know, they were still terrible. Nevertheless, they were still awful. And in fact, the same power dynamic is still at work on this penal colony with this new commandant. And I kind of think that on some level that the new commandant is doing what any powerful person does when they sense that there is this growing dissension out there, that the public is starting to get a little bit angry at the system. They throw them a few crumbs, right? They'll say, okay, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. And they do that in order to maintain their own power, right? If I throw them these crumbs, if I just give them a little bit, then they are no longer going to be a threat to my power. And you can kind of see the new commandant potentially is, we don't ever see the new commandant in the story, but you can kind of potentially assume that that's what they're doing. Obviously everybody hates this execution device now. Obviously the public is starting to disrespect the authorities there. And so the new commandant's not going to be in favor of the execution device. In order to maintain their own power and still maintain their power over the people on the penal colony, they'll say, okay, well, we'll get rid of it. And I would say that the traveler also doesn't want anybody to threaten his power either. And let's not forget, this is a guy who is from this home country, France. And France, again, one of the reasons why there's a penal colony is because they just don't want to deal with all the people that they have criminalized in their country. So they're sending them away. Make that somebody else's problem. We'll send them away to basically be tortured on an island far, far away, and we can wipe our hands clean of it, and we don't have to deal with it anymore, really. I mean, we're connected to this penal colony, but we don't have to see it. We can just pretend as if it doesn't exist, right? And you can kind of see that the traveler is like this as well. He's visiting this penal colony. Who knows why? We don't know why, but you could potentially assume that they have maybe a voyeuristic interest in it. Maybe they are part of the government, the French government, in some ways, but they don't really want to get their hands dirty with it. They want to see it and leave and go back to their home and their place of comfort. Right. In many ways, this traveler character is kind of like the liberal figure in Phil Oakes's song "Love Me, I'm a Liberal," like that kind of classic liberal character. If you don't know Phil Oakes's song "Love Me, I'm a Liberal," I do highly suggest looking at it, listening to it, where he in the character of a conventional liberal says things like, I love all the races, but as long as they don't move in next door, or I'll send all the money that you ask me for, but just don't ask me to come along. Sure, I'll, from the comfort of my home, I'll send off some money, but you're going to be the one actually doing the hard work out there. I'm not going to get my hands dirty. And I think that the traveler probably has this superior attitude. In fact, the officer even calls him out on this earlier on in the story. He says of the traveler, this is a quote, "You're caught up in European perspectives. Perhaps you are a principled opponent of the death penalty in general." So, yeah, I think he is this so-called enlightened European, but he's also hardly better than the officer, because when it comes time to when he can actually use his power to do something, he just maintains the status quo, right? He refuses to allow the prisoners to escape from what is surely a barbaric and brutal system, with or without the device. Yes, he'll shake his head and oh dear, and be very mournful at the backwardness of this place. But he also, when it comes time to do anything meaningful to help, will do nothing, and we know that the traveler actually might have some sway, because Kafka actually spends a fair amount of time with the officer explaining to the traveler. He says to him, "Your influence cannot be overstated." Because the traveler himself says, "What am I going to do to convince the new commandant?" When the officer is trying to say to him, "All you just need to do is put in a good word and this thing will continue." The traveler says, what would I do? What can I do? And the officer is really convinced that the traveler could actually do something. And maybe the officer is deluded, but maybe the officer is actually right, and it's potentially related to the fact that this guy is from the homeland. He's from France, he's from this place that has been, in a colonial mindset, has been positioned as superior in every way, right? So if this person comes from France and says, I really like this device, then it might have some sway. So there is I think, a good possibility that this guy does have some kind of power, this traveler, but he shirks his responsibility for doing anything of value with it. Yeah, he doesn't get rid of the execution device, right? It is destroyed by the end of the story, but it falls apart on its own, right? The only action that the traveler genuinely takes in the story is that he makes sure that the people who are trapped on the penal colony stay trapped on the penal colony. That's really the only thing that he does in terms of an actual action in the text. And I think that in showing us this, that Kafka is calling attention to sort of our own complicity as reader. He's saying, you as readers, that there are things like this that are going on. That there are people who are oppressed. That there are hideous, barbaric things that are going on. And you can either choose to act on your responsibility, or you can be like the traveler and just sort of shake your head at the injustice of it all, but do everything possible to keep it from encroaching on your own sort of safe and secure lifestyle. And that's why I think that this is such a powerful story. If it was just a story about, this horrible execution device, then it would be extraordinarily interesting, especially the way that Kafka writes about it. But the way that it calls out the sort of the mournful, well-meaning figure, and therefore also sort of calls us out, who are in very much the same position at the end of the story as the traveler pulls away from the penal colony and we close the book. we're in very much the same position. And I think Kafka is asking us, what are we going to do with our own responsibility? Although at the same time, he makes it very clear that the system is set up in a way that makes it very hard for us to act on our responsibilities. But that doesn't mean we don't have them. So with that in mind, I'm going to end it here. Once again, if you liked this discussion, please feel free to like the video. And if you haven't subscribed, please feel free to subscribe. I'm going to do another Kafka text somewhere down the road, the castle. But otherwise, stay tuned for the next one. There should be another one next week. Have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.